Okay, the different hemispheres and the actual cerebral cortex taken to pieces as to what have we got there. So we have got our brain split into two hemispheres, so two halves. Usually we get right-handed people, which is the left is dominant, and that's kind of a standard, but it can simply be the other way around. And the nerve fibers from right run to left, from left run to right. So you've got to have an overlap zone where those nerve fibers actually, where the axons of those neurons cross over to the other side, and that is taking place in the corpus callosum, sitting in the diagram where you see that here, just above the midbrain. Sorry, part of the midbrain. And some areas of the brain, speech centers particularly, are seeming to be one-sided, lateralized, so literally just on the left or on the right. It's unclear why that is, just is, and it's we'll get to how we actually know from various injuries and strokes and so on. So, like I mentioned earlier, you've got the grey matter on the outside, which is where you've got your cell bodies. And the more surface area, the more wrinkles you've got, the more sort of foldings you get, the more surface you get. The inner area is white, which is where it is myelinated. And there is an evolutionary link where you see smaller and smoother brains in primitive animals compared to obviously primates and then humans. It's also, the cortex is also sometimes called neocortex. And you've got here a nice little link you may want to go on where I've got this picture from, and the associated cost in terms of maintaining that sort of brain structure rather than something easy to maintain, because that all requires ATP to be running on. A lovely second phylogenetic tree, and I don't know what overlap questions you're going to get, just that you have seen those between the different brains and areas. Just nice picture for you to kind of see. If you want to look at that a bit further, just pause the video on this to kind of see. Like I said, the dolphin is an interesting one to kind of compare to, because they're not doing bad with connections either. So lobes, again, this is all going to be a learning them by heart. A lot of this part of option neurobiology is just memorizing. It's just memorizing their names and what they do. So we're going to go in order, nice and slow. So first one, the frontal lobe, front because it sits kind of forehead front area of your skull cranium. You have got in there parts of what is personality, some of it unconscious. You're not aware of your personality, it's just there. Reasoning, planning, emotion, problem solving. We're going to get to the Broca's area for speech a bit later on. For me, as a right-handed person, that would be in the left hemisphere in the frontal lobe. You've also got the motor cortex in the frontal lobe, running as a sort of a line. We'll get to that, kind of a line across the sort of mid of your head. So that's frontal lobe. You also have the temporal lobes sitting on the sides. Your auditory cortex is in there. I'm being specific there. This is sound perception, but not yet making meaning of those sounds. This is just where the sound information is coming in from the auditory nerve. You are having also the processing of something slightly more complex, as in objects in a room, gestures of somebody's face and gestures with their hands, learning and memory, but not yet the permanent part. Not the permanent part. You have got there, again, that's going with the speech recognition, a bit like where the Broca's area for speech and the verb area is on the dominant hemisphere. In my case, that would be in my left hemisphere, the Wernicke's area, which again has to do with speech. We'll look at those two speech areas at a later point in a bit more detail. Generally, they're on both sides of your head, and neither area is dominant except for those speech areas, which have got just specific roles in speech interpretation and word forming, the word salad thing. We'll get to that later on as well. Third area of your cranium, third area is your parietal lobe, which is where you make sense of what your taste buds receive, the interpretation of that taste, visual and 3D processing. So You get the visual information in through the occipital lobe in the very back. However, the parietal lobe then makes meaning of that visual information, not just here's a light dot, here a dark dot, here's a red, blue, green, whatever information, that actually now is making meaning of those pictures coming in. And you've got the somatosensory cortex, which is, again, a bit like the motor cortex lying next to it across the top of your head. And the last one, that is your occipital lobe, which is your visual information coming in, again, right to left, left to right, those optical nerves cross over. And you get a very basic information, a basic visual input, not yet processing, just input. Right. It's a lovely diagram here for what I tried to explain to you with regards to the motor cortex as a sort of line across the head in the frontal lobe still, the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe, slightly further back. Those two will keep us busy when we're looking at the homunculi. We'll get to that a bit later on. So the sensory cortex receives the external information. So that's all your sensory neurons from your body coming in. So if you were, let's say you're squeezing somebody's finger, you can see lighting up under an fMRI, we'll get to that, in whichever region of the somatosensory cortex. So that's where we're receiving information in. It all crosses over, as per earlier, in the corpus callosum, right to left, left to right. And the motor information, the motor cortex, that is the outwards, the effector nerves, the effector neurons. Practical investigation, electrically stimulate part of the motor cortex and then see which parts of the body move or which glands are stimulated. We'll get to how we know a bit later. Okay, the other areas, the association areas that you have got. You have got the Broca's and Wernicke's late, we're going to go to those speech areas. This is just kind of that you're seeing physically where they would be in the temporal lobe and in the frontal lobe. So the Wernicke's is still in the temporal, that's in the frontal lobe. And you've got also links, areas, the fasciculus, which links the speech to the actual movement of your lips and vocal cords. So that is another outgoing thought. Speech is a tricky area, so that's requiring another area of the brain here. Right, all the association areas do, if you, I've put that in brackets there, interpret, 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 that you've got that. You've got information coming in, but you need to make meaning of that information. So all of those association areas get information in and then make sense of it, make meaning of it. They initiate areas to then tell the motor cortex, move your lips like this, move your face muscles and produce this and this gesture, move your hands in that particular way. So they initiate that response. They're generating meaning from new and stored information. So that is a combining for what is actually already in your sort of saved bank. Visual information from the occipital lobe is being interpreted. Auditory information is being interpreted. Just a little bit, and then I'm going to have to switch off again. The stroke types. Some of the information that we know is because we know of which areas have been damaged in the brain. You've got two major different types of strokes, the ones that come from blockages and the ones that come from bleeds. The ischemic strokes, that's a blockage, either a clot or a thrombus or an embolus. That is literally different ways of how can you block something off. You might remember your plaque formation, and if a plaque itself breaks off, or a thrombus that started forming on top of a plaque and that then breaks off, that could clog off. Emboli form usually if there is some sort of air and blood clotting forming in loosely within the bloodstream. It's just literally think of clotted and lumped up blood. That's just blocking. Stops the blood supply to an area of the brain. And yes, you've still got the cerebrospinal fluid supplying some oxygen, but it may just not be enough. No oxygen, no glucose, therefore no ATP can be generated in respiration. the usual pathway that you'd get to a heart attack as well happens there as well, that no ATP and therefore no respiration, nothing is taking place anymore. The hemorrhagic shocks are if you're getting a breakage of one of those capillaries or arterioles in the brain. They're usually coming with severe headaches, and that is, yeah, literally an arteriole ruptures or tears open. Pretty diagram just to show the difference between a block, which would be your ischemic, or your hemorrhagic. This here is not in your syllabus, but you might as well know what a TIA is, a transient ischemic attack, which is a part block and can give you stroke symptoms for a while and then they loosen again. Now, that would be sort of alert for future strokes. They usually are sort of warning signs that a proper stroke is on the way. Typical risk factors, as in heart health and brain health, are sadly linked. High blood pressure, smoking, obesity, high blood cholesterol, and then it all increases age upwards. So they are not magic risk factors. There's the same risk factors as go with your heart health. Images of strokes, just that you know what this little axis on the bottom would be, A for anterior, P for posterior, and then the left and right as to what are you looking at. Top down, bottom up at this point does not matter, just so you see that an area that has not received the blood supply it needed to get. And I hope you know the keyword fast for if you see, it's usually one-sided facial weakness or the face dropping on one side, one arm or one side of the body going limp and not responding, speech problems, somebody suddenly having slurred speech. At that point, you do not want to muck about. At that point, you are calling for an ambulance. The pathology, the blood flow to that region of the brain has stopped, therefore no ATP. It's also called an infarction, similar to a heart, and it usually is a one-sided thing, that one-sided face drop. Right, I'm conscious of my 15 minutes for YouTube.